Dobry Tuberovsky. Well, another May 9th Victory Day has rolled around. 68 years since the Soviet Army, it hadn't been called Red Army since 1919, rolled back the forces of fascism from the European continent. Although May 8th was the day of formal unconditional surrender of the Axis to United Nations forces, the time difference has meant the day's celebration on May 9th in the USSR as Soviet Victory Day in tandem with May 8th VE Day. Many USians, and increasingly many Euros, seem to believe that it was the Western Allies who beat Hitler, that Russia was important, but as a helper to the West's fighting forces. The real history of the world's bloodiest theater of war is, as usual, not in keeping with fatuous Western and American smugness, and in fact is quite the reverse. 3/4 of the fighting and of the human casualties of war were in the Eastern theater behind the later post-war Iron Curtain. These two facts are causally related. Those who celebrated the rollback of communism in 1989 were quite ambivalent about the rollback of fascism in 1945. Remember that glorious American freedom fighter Ronald Reagan, laying a wreath 40 years later at Bitburg Military Cemetery in honor of German war dead, which included SS troops. This was not only part of a Cold War NATO deal with Chancellor Helmut Kohl as payoff for Kohl's allowing Pershing II missiles on German soil, but Reagan genuinely saw nothing wrong with it. When told by Holocaust survivors, notably Elie Wiesel, "Mr. President, this is not the place," Mr. President's response was that the SS troops buried there were the villains, as we know, that conducted the persecutions and all, but there are 2,000 graves there, and most of those, the average age is about 18. I think that there's nothing wrong with visiting that cemetery where those young men are victims of Nazism also, even though they were fighting in German uniform, drafted into service to carry out the hateful wishes of the Nazis. They were victims just as surely as the victims in the concentration camps, except that these alleged victims were not dehumanized by the Nazi state and disposed of like organic waste. One might as well say that those segregated by apartheid and those doing the segregating were equal victims. Wait, he did say that too. That's why Reagan could advocate constructive engagement with South Africa, along with constructive remembrance of Nazi war dead. One might also as well say that the victim of an armed robbery and his robber are both victims of an unjust society, the very kind of soft-hearted liberalism Reagan prided himself on mocking throughout the rest of his career. But then, crimes in the U.S. are largely not committed by white Nazis, so it was safe as well as expedient. But even when they are committed by white Nazis, as in OK City in 1995, we might note that they're given a laissez-passer as opposed to the demonization of Muslims and their beliefs. The U.S. will not lower itself into totalitarianism to fight Nazis, but it will do so to fight Muslims down to the last woman and child. Just as Reagan could never bring himself to lay a wreath at the graves of Soviet soldiers, supposed allies against Hitler. By Reagan's tortured senile reasoning, these Soviet troops were obviously not victims of Hitler, but Hitler's own troops were. And in honor of these German war victims, Reagan refused to balance his visit to Bitburg by visiting a concentration camp for the real victims in Germany, because it would offend his hosts. Which, for anyone believing in the defeat of Hitler and Nazi genocide, should be no problem, and so it goes. Following the rollback of communism, the spirit of those villains rose like the undead from the tombs of Bitburg. Neo-Nazis seized the streets of unified Germany. Aged Nazi collaborators emerged from the woodwork of the Baltic states to accept their medals of wartime service in the SS, or political collaborators like Romania's Marshal Ion Antonescu had statues erected to them in open mockery of the hundreds of thousands of victims of genocide in that Axis ally alone. In the spirit of Ronald Reagan, they were now lauded as national heroes as their nations prepared to join NATO. For them, NATO was an extension of the Third Reich, a chapter in the same struggle, which explains in good measure why there was an Iron Curtain. Ronald Reagan showed why the USSR was so paranoid in those post-war years and constructed a front of internal police states and a barbed wire boundary across the center of Europe. Having defeated Hitler, Western forces seemed to take up the struggle of Lebensraum in the East, not for settlers so much as for Western investment room for capital, with NATO blitzkrieging across the countryside after the other side had appeased its aggression. The war generation of the USSR was not about to throw away the sacrifice of its over 20 million casualties to appease these Western interests and Western values. That would have to come after that greatest generation had retired from power. The Yugoslav ex-communist Milovan Djilas wrote in his wartime memoirs, Conversations with Stalin, that Stalin allegedly told him, "This war is not like wars in the past. Now a victorious power must impose its own social system as far as its armies can reach." This is what the USSR did, and strongly felt it had the right to do so, in compensation for its own suffering. Along with this came a vindictive regime of conquest for his zone, as opposed to the coddling form of liberation in the Western zone, for former Nazis and their collaborators and corporate sponsors. One can argue that the post-war rollback of fascism did not equal justice, but that was equally true on both sides of the post-war divide. So, as you mock Soviet Victory Day and bitch and sneer at the red flags and Stalin images and shake your head at backward Russia that just doesn't get what freedom and democracy and such is all about, just remember you, in Europe especially, will not be enjoying your freedom and democracy without the crushing of the Nazi war machine by Stalin, the Soviet Army, and the Soviet Union, because your appeasing Western leadership would surely not have stood up to Hitler if the Soviet Union had gone down and would have left you to stew under fascism. So, uh-oh, wonder if YouTube's going to start charging for this line. Hello? General Franco of Spain, you want to disagree with this video? You want these viewers to know that it was your glorious Iberian victory over Bolshevism in 1939 that made the victory of 1989 possible? But that's our point, isn't it? The Cold War was part of your same struggle, and I agree with you. It was war and aggression, and the rich and powerful who won in 1939 and 1989. I mean, look around you in fascist heaven at Reagan and Mad Maggie Thatcher and Milton Friedman and Augusto Pinochet. Your side did win.